Here's my video about the Peloponnesian War. It's the request that I got from Kay, and that came from my last video. Oh, right now it's 12:23 a.m. on April 1st, Saturday, and I kind of was sleeping, and then I got up, so I'm fresh, totally fresh. If I yawn, it's because I was smoking a bunch of weed before I did this. I don't even feel that high. I'm gonna smoke all of my money in weed. And then Ben Savage, my main commenter, said, yeah, you should do the Polynesian War. So, I'll do the Peloponnesian War now, and then when I'm done with my website, or maybe when I'm done listening to the books and stuff, maybe I'll do another one, soon even, because it's interesting. When Kay gave me the request, I was like, oh. Because to ask somebody to do a video about the Peloponnesian War, it's kind of like the ultimate intelligence test. It's a personality test, and it's also what could be. I think it's the most widely talked about historical subject. If you type Peloponnesian War on YouTube, you'll get more people talking about that than anything. And so that's another thing I was doing, was watching all these people talk about the Peloponnesian War and getting all these different perspectives, Not only do you learn more about the war with each person you watch a video, but you learn more about people and their perspective. And you learn where, the things that nobody talks about. So the thing that you could talk about if you wanted to be original. So the request was, what do I think about, just do a book review of Donald Kagan's Peloponnesian War. Donald Kagan was a professor at Yale for 40 years or something. And then back in 2010, I noticed, 2011, I noticed they had all these lectures on the Yale YouTube channel, and Donald Kagan was actually the one that I found the most interesting, because he was talking about the Peloponnesian War, and he was already old then, when it must have been probably at the end of his whole tenure when he did the lecture, and he was smacking and swallowing, and it's you have to get used to all those noises. I actually wrote Yale, and I was like, you guys need to edit those noises out, man. It's so easy. And it'd make it such a better experience, because he's really smart, and I want to listen to it again. But I listened to the entire series back then, and then I listened to it again when the person told me to read the book. I read the book, which was 19 hours, and then I listened to his speech, which was another 20 hours or something. And and then I want to listen to it again. There's another lecturer. I think I woke up my ferrets. They were up before, and they wanted to run around, but my tegu is running around right now, and I don't want them to run around together at the same time. My tegu is so cute, because I went into the living room to put water in the tank, and my tegu originally was sleeping underneath the water bowl. And then as I was putting the water in, I noticed his head had poked up. And then when I put the other water bowl there, he was straight up standing on his ramp, ready to go, open up this thing. That's cute. He's technically brumating. He hasn't eaten for 6 months, but he's an adventurous brumator. So anyway, so this other guy was doing these really good lectures, man. I want to listen to his lecture again. It was just an hour-long lecture or whatever. Another old professor, can't remember his name. And then he wrote a book that's 13 hours that's free on Audible that I'm listening to. So that I listened to, and then now I'm listening to his book, and I'm almost done with his book. Awesome book, because he does more like modern day research to paint the world of how it is, like with the numbers and stuff. It's really cool. Hope I don't wake up my roommate. My roommate's kind of a stickler for sound, but my door's closed and everything. So here, I'm gonna close the door in my bathroom. I'll be right back. So, yeah, the Peloponnesian War lasted 27 years, so there's a lot to talk about. And it's surrounded by really interesting history. And so it's really interesting, easy to get sidetracked on that other stuff. So I'll try to briefly explain what happened in the other parts of it, like before and after, because that's really interesting. You want to know that. I first learned about the Peloponnesian War, which you could also call the like Athens versus Sparta war, or you could call it a world war from the world of the Greeks, or the Great Civil War of the Greeks. And I first learned about it in 10th grade in high school. It was the very first high school experience, because high school started at 10th grade for me, and it was the first quarter. And the history teacher gave a lecture for like a couple weeks or something just on the Peloponnesian War, and most of what I know about it is what I learned then. I remember the main stuff, but he never finished it. All he said was that Sparta won, and that was it. We moved on to something else. But basically, what happened with the Peloponnesian War is that the Syrians, the great empire of the time, which was centered in Ephesus, in like South Turkey, I think, tried to take over the Greeks in like 485 or something BC. And so then the Greeks tried to set up bring all themselves together so that they could fight them off again, because they were afraid he was going to come back, and he came out with like a army of 300,000 the first time. He built a bridge of boats all the way across the Hellespont to Istanbul to ferry his army across. And that's when they had the Battle of Marathon that the Greeks won, and then Philippides ran all the way to the Marathon all the way to Athens to tell them that they won, and the 300 Spartans fought them off in the canyon Cynocephaly in southern Thessaly. I actually bike toured that in 2010, and I didn't see anything like a narrow canyon, dude. I just rode down the side of this mountain, and then there was the sea, and I saw the sign for the battle, and I was like, where's the canyon? It was so weird. It must have been one of the tiny little canyons, kind of like in Boulder, like as you go up one of the foothills. It must have been something like that. I don't know, but anyway, yeah, so then they made the Delian League, where they tried to collect money so that they could make a fleet so that they could fight off the Persians when they come back. But they had they were having some skirmishes, which made them nervous that the Persians were going to be able to come out and steal the money from the island of Delos. It was called the Delian League, because they put all of their taxes that they were going to use for like the rainy day taxes for the war, the possible future war, on the island of Delos, because it was like a neutral place, and they didn't want to have a capital. You know, it was like a federation. But then Athens, without asking anybody, just transported all of um, the funds, the gold from Delos to Athens, and built the Acropolis. So the Acropolis was like the original bank. It was like Fort Knox, to up on the top of the hill to secure it more, so it would be more better secured. But then Athens started. You made a decree that said that 1/60th of the taxes of all the Greece that go to now the Acropolis in Athens goes to Athena, goes to Athens, and so then they used that money to build a big wall around Athens that went all the way to the sea. I think it was. Let's see, there's my roommate. I think it was like like 17 miles around or something, like pretty big. And so then that kind of pissed people off. And Donald Kagan, who does the lecture, says that Thucydides, and I read his book. That's like 800 pages. To see the reason we know about the Peloponnesian War is that one of the main generals of the war was the guy who wrote the book, Thucydides, and he was able to write the book because he got exiled for 20 years because he made a mistake. He lost a battle, and so for 20 years he was this really rich guy. He was just hanging out on his villa, like interviewing people from both sides of the war and just spending all his extra time writing about the war. And the book ends mid-sentence in like one of the final battles of the war, and because he died somehow, they don't know why, how, but so we have to know what happened for the rest of the war from Anaxagoras, or another writer. But a lot of like, oh man, I can't even remember. God damn it, I should have looked before I did the video, but possibly like most of the classical writings come from that period, from Athens. And so we know so much, and oh man, I should have looked. See, this is what I'm going to do for my next video. In like a month or two, I'll know all this stuff. But yeah, there's more. We know more about that period of history than like any time in history, because they preserved it, because they had so much respect for it, and they had so many copies of it that got around so much, that even though it was so long ago, we know so much about it. So it was really cool, and because there's all those different writers that you can write. Rome had a lot too, from the 1st century BC and even into the 1st century AD. Seneca, I think, was the last of and he was Nero's tutor. He was the last of like the writers from Rome that we can get, but most of them are in like the 1st century BC. It's kind of like comparable in volume, but there's a lot. Like Plato's dialogues is like 3,300 pages. It's like as big as all of Cicero's. And so anyways, back to the story. So Athens, they pissed off everybody. And so Donald Kagan said that Thucydides, and I didn't actually read the whole book of Thucydides because I was doing work on my timeline and I was having to think too much, and I can't pay attention to a book if a robot is reading it to me. Oh my God, why don't I have it on I should have listened to it on Audible, on LibriVox. They certainly have it on LibriVox. But even then, somebody reading a book, I wasn't in the mood. But I'll do that for my next video. But anyway, got myself lost my train of thought. So Thucydides says that the war happened because Sparta freaked out and basically didn't allow Athens to grow into the manifest destiny empire that they were supposed to grow into, because Sparta knew that that meant certain death for Sparta. And I think Donald Kagan agreed with that, and I agree with that too. And Athens brought that about because they weren't treating the subjects of the Athenian Empire with enough respect, that their subjects would turn and just help Sparta then instead. And so even though Sparta, to the intellectuals, was clearly the political system that was on its way out, and they should have been supporting Athens, but Athens just made too many mistakes. So the moral of the story is like the Greek tragedy. Greeks had comedies, but they're mainly known for their tragedies. And well, Athens and the Greek Empire in itself, in reality, ended up being a tragedy. And it got me thinking. I was like, well, did those tragedy writers happen right after the war? And actually, they wrote right at the beginning, like Oedipus Rex, the most famous tragedy story, where the guy has sex with his mother and then tears his eyes out when he realizes that his wife, the queen, was actually his mother. It's just a story, not a real story, but a story from the tragedy. That came out in 430 BC, and the Peloponnesian War started in 431. And actually came out the same year as the plague, because the plague of Athens started, which 75 to 100,000 people died. 1/3 to 2/3 of Athens died. That came out in the same year as the plague. But the other tragedies happened before, like the first tragedy happened in 484, which was like right after the Battle of Marathon. And then other tragedy, the other famous ones happened kind of at the beginning. So the tragedy writers kind of prophesied what was going to happen with the Greek world, with the Peloponnesian War. They kind of saw it coming from the very beginning. They saw what was not going to work. Kind of, if you want to connect the two. And so basically, what happened, just overall, what happened with the Peloponnesian War is that, in 2 pages or less, the 2-minute bite, is that there was this kind of like miracle situation in Greece, where there were all of these individual city-states, up to 1,000 of them in the Greek world, and in the periphery of all those islands. So they were getting around and traveling really well with lots of cargo, so they could trade and get really wealthy and rich. They were trading. Athens was getting their grain from Egypt, the same place that Rome was. That's what made them so rich. And they could trade real easily, because it was this beautiful empire of people. They took the whole western part of Anatolia, of Turkey, like Troy area, all the way up the top, and then the Peloponnese. So everybody had water, and like all these thousands of islands was beautiful. And then even the southern part with Egypt. And and then they're making colonies, and then they were even communicating with Syracuse, which was the biggest city in the whole area in Sicily, who was part of the Greek world, and even Rome was part of the Greek world from before that time. So, like, to paint a picture of how worldly that whole area was, like, the Peloponnesian War started in 431, and Xerxes tried to take over the Greek world in like 485, and the reason that Xerxes tried to take over the Greek world was because I think Xerxes' like father, his brother tried to. This is all written about in Herodotus's histories. Like most of Herodotus's histories is talking about the Syrian Empire. His brother tried to do a coup. I guess he felt slighted in the family, didn't get enough inheritance. So he hired 10,000 Spartans, because they were the ones who had the recommendation. I don't think it was just Spartans, but to go down and overthrow his brother, because he figured with an army of 10,000 he could defeat any army, because the Greeks were such badass fighters, and then take over. But and then he was going to do it. He was going to be successful. The Greeks kicked the shit out of the Persians, and he was going to be the king. But the problem was he died in the battle. So the Greeks had to escape back like 2,000 miles or something. Can't remember. I don't know, like 800 miles or something, all the way across Turkey back to Greece, and it was only like 3,000 of them, I think, that were Spartans. But that's the book Anabasis by Xenophon, which you can read about that story. It's on my website. And so I think Xerxes was pissed off about that and wanted to take over Greece, because he didn't want Greeks to try to take over Persia again with the 10,000, or get hired by the Greeks, because the Greeks were known, or somebody would hire the Greeks to help them take it over, because the Greeks were known as being badass fighters. And so, but in the year 509, that's when Rome became a republic. And so in the like, the 480s, like, in the beginning, 510s, 480s, the end of the 500s, beginning of the 480s, 490s, into the 6th century, beginning of the 5th century BC. Sorry, into the 7th century, beginning of the 6th century BC. Like, the Greeks were starting to get developed again with their trade, and they're getting civilization back and their population numbers back after the Bronze Age collapse, which happened in 1185 due to a volcano that blew up somewhere and caused crops to die, which caused people from the north, Scythians, to come down and raid, and they snuffed out written language for 400 years. And they got written language back in like, Homer wasn't 800, and that was before they got written language back. I can't remember. I think they got written language back around like 650, and so it was only like 200 years after they got their written language back when they're finally getting their civilization. And so everybody's starting to go republic. Like, they're starting to make a transition into getting more and more developed. They're, with all, because they all had all these different individual city-states, so that they were all communicating with each other with the boats. So they all knew the history of each other, and they knew which forms of government worked better, like, than we do now. Like, we know now from what reading from them. Like Aristotle wrote a story about how one city-state was taken over by Scythians or something, so they were taken in by another city-state, but then they took over the city-state that took them in, and then, he was writing about the 5 forms of government where you go in a circle, like you have a democracy, but then you have an oligarch take over, so then it becomes a tyranny, and then the tyranny turns into a aristocracy, an oligarchy. You know, just the family of the tyrant, and then the oligarchy turns into an aristocracy, which then turns into a democracy, which then turns into a tyranny, and then you just go in circles. And so in that time, you know, Rome became a republic in 509. And so Rome was part of the Mediterranean world, you know. That's like probably a question that a lot of people have. Like, some people like to say, oh, Greece was before Rome, but like Rome became a republic because the Oracle of Delphi told them to. Like they didn't like their king because he raped one of the noble women, Lucretia, who killed herself to try to get her husband to overthrow the prince, the king. And so they went to, only like 3 guys. There was like 3 of them. I know this has nothing to do with that, but 3 of them. The guy who raped the princess, the woman, and then the guy who ended up Brutus, who ended up becoming the first leader of Rome, and then some other guy. They traveled all the way to Delphi in like 510 BC or something. Just the 3 of them, they traveled all the way to Delphi because they wanted to ask the Delphi what to do. So the Romans were part of the Greek-Roman world. And, you know, they knew it was dangerous, but they made it. And so, you know, you could do that kind of stuff. And so everybody knew about Rome at the time, but everybody's going republic. And so everybody also knew that Sparta was a vestige of a level of development that was incompatible with empire. Sparta was the perfect example of a city-state, of a really strong city-state that could maintain control over, like, you know, an area around them, like the size of the Peloponnesian. But the problem was for Sparta was that Sparta lived inside of a Greek-Roman world that was ripe for empire, and empire is not compatible with the political system of Sparta. And they were ripe for empire because the Greeks, this is what I was trying to get to before, the Greeks I'm trying to make my cockatiel shut up. The Greeks, my roommate won't hear me, I'll have the cockatiel instead. The Greeks just so happened to have that entire area, right? And all that wealth from all that trade and the breadbasket of Egypt. And they even had good farming in Thessaly up in north. But they all happened to speak the same language. The Spartans and the Athenians spoke the same language, and all those Greeks, because after the Bronze Age collapse, everybody died. Like, civilization dried up. So then after the plants grew back and they could repopulate, that's when the Dorians came down in like the 900s or something, which were people from the north, like Germans, Germanic types. Big, strong hunters, high protein, with a warrior philosophy and culture, individualistic and all that kind of stuff. And they all came down like in a big tribe who all speak one language, Dorian language. And then they populated Greece. They took over Greece, and I think there were some other individual groups that they took over. And then they adopted, and then they inherited Greece, populated it. So it's kind of like America, like all of the English people go to America. In the Mayflower, not that many people, but then they populate, and so then we all speak there's like the same American accent in this huge area. And so it's a perfect situation for like, it's like somebody God handing us a civilization, empire on a platter, because we all magically speak the same language, because we all filled in this empty area that was actually ripe for society, because it was empty only because there was a catastrophe before that emptied it out, and then they fill it up with the same language. And so that was a really cool thing. The Greek world, they all speak the same language. And so, like in ancient times in Rome, like the Scots and the Brits, the northern side and the southern side of the island of Britain spoke completely different languages. Yet the Greeks, all the way across the Mediterranean, they speak the same. So anyway, so Sparta was smack dab in the middle of that, like, not compatible. Because Sparta was from an Iron Age civilization, not from a Bronze Age empire civilization. Because in a Bronze Age, like an empire civilization, Iron Age civilization, you have like complex society, because you have all that trade organization, you have technology with the boats, which then gives you war technology. In a more Bronze Age society, you rely more on like, not horses. People don't have horses, and people just fight hand to hand, and so it's kind of like the city-state idea. You'd have a kingdom that's like 20 kilometers across, and then there's the other one, and it's kind of like a mind your own business. Your area, it's basically the size of a kingdom would be as far as the eye can see. That's your kingdom. So if you live in a valley surrounded by mountains, naturally you're going to have a kingdom that's that area. And you can show it with Google Earth and prove it how it's like that. I mean, Rome was like that. And they even had the names for it and stuff, for like your area that you can see. And so and that's about how big those like Sparta's control was. And so Sparta was a really cool civilization, because and for the Spartans, because they had 10,000 I guess men. I can't remember. Yeah, because they could field an army of 10,000, and or could they field an army of 3,000? I'll figure all this out for the next video, but I think they had like 10,000 Spartans. So it was like a good-sized city-state, with all the people could know each other, but living in the city of Sparta. But none of them worked. Okay, they were all professional warriors. So all they did from sunrise until sunset, their entire lives, was trained to fight. So it was like professional athletes from BC times, which is really freaking trippy to think about. Like there's ways to work your way around things if you don't have technology. Kind of reminds you of the Greeks with their slaves, throwing like Elagabalus, having the slaves pour like rose petals down continuously on him as he's having dinner. If you're rich enough, you can be pretty creative. But and so they controlled, because they were part of the Dorians. They came down there, and it was probably an extreme version of the Dorian invasion. Like there were probably other lesser extreme versions, like where the Dorians come down and then they take over like the little villages of the original people who were there from before, from the Bronze Ages, turn them into their slaves because they're better warriors than they are, because these are just like farmers hanging out. Only those people came from the north fighting their way down. Turn them into their slaves, and then they farm for them, and then they rule, right? So then Sparta took it to just the ridiculous levels where they made everybody around them their farmers for them. They were called helots. And within the eye you can, as far as the eye can see, it was just farms where it was their slaves. And the Spartans would for fun, and part of their training would just run around, patrol, go on patrol, run around or ride around on their horses, their ponies, looking for helots who were too tall. And if they were taller than average, like as tall as a Spartan, they would kill him just for being tall. Or if they saw a helot who was like walking around with strutting his stuff, walking like a ninja or something, they would kill him because they wanted to keep him down. Because they were always having like helot rebellions, and the helots made it no secret that they hated Spartans. And the helots were famous for saying that they would eat their Spartan master's flesh raw if they could. And, and helots would escape from time to time. It's kind of like North Korea. Ancient Sparta is kind of the future, the modern day analog is North Korea. Every once in a while, a helot will escape and tell the horrors of what it's like living under Spartan dominion, and that they have to kill those fucking Spartans. Because the Spartan did this and the Spartan did that. So, if you're in a period of like Bronze Age, where to some degree all these different Dorian invaders are doing that, your surrounding city-states aren't really gonna care that much. When a helot says, "Oh, they've been abusing me," because they probably have their own kind of version of helots as well, and that's partly why Athens couldn't get the other islands in the Greek world to side with Athens. They kept siding with Sparta because they just didn't. So, but the problem was there weren't enough helots escaping, and then when they would escape, they would only tell their story to the little town next to them, and then the story wouldn't percolate far enough out to like get people thinking. People didn't think about enough things through about how the civilization evolves. And so Sparta is a really cool place to think about. I mean, it would be great I want to see, they should make movies about Sparta. It'd be great to be a Spartan. But you have to understand, and people should have been explaining that that's just an ephemeral system of government, and that there has to be a way to ease out of that. Sparta was kind of like the slave country, the slave states of the United States in the early 1800s, where the slaves would escape, and people in the North knew that we were going to have to do something about it. And so, but I mean, it's an interesting thing to study. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to think about. Like, they had to use like iron tablets, iron bars for money, because they wanted to keep them poor, so that the Spartan citizens poor, so that they would only focus on war and being good warriors and training all the time. I mean, I'd love to be a Spartan, just to train all the time, because like that's what we can do now. Like we should use Sparta as an inspiration for now, to try to create a civilization of warriors, or pro athletes who are paid, who just get to be pro athletes. And because we have the technology, we can have technology take care of us instead of slaves. And so, we should call ourselves the Spartans, and only look at the good part of Sparta for that. But overall, that whole keeping one group of people as a slave, especially since they were the original ones there, I mean, that's kind of evil. That was eventually going to have to evolve, where you give proper respect to the people you moved in on. And so that is why Athens had such fervor to go out and fight and spread, because everybody in Athens knew how much better it was. If you look at ancient Rome, 100% of the literature that comes out of ancient Greece is from Athens. 0% comes from Sparta, and 0% was ever going to come from Sparta, because Spartans never read or wrote. They only did it minimally to have to deal with the other people. But they were pro athletes. They were stuck. They were stuck in the Bronze Age, because they had it so good. They were going to keep themselves in the Bronze Age and just fight tooth and nail to get out of from getting out of the Bronze Age. They were like a human society version of a gorilla. Humans come from gorillas, but the gorilla wanted to stay a gorilla and stay in the jungle. And sometimes you have to force certain tribes and groups of people out of their comfort zone. So they were just stuck in their comfort zone, basically. And so Athens had this strong desire to become a empire because they could see all the cool things they were doing. They could see how they could facilitate an empire of Greeks. They knew how to build that Parthenon. They built that huge Parthenon on the hill, and with those huge blocks, and made those triremes and all those riders, and they made all these scientific discoveries. Like, this was all in the period after they kicked out the Persians, and even during the Peloponnesian War. I could look at my timeline to get it exact, but like the first part of the Peloponnesian War. So they're all piecing it together. So see, the tragedy is that as it was all coming up, that's when they had the World War, which then just wiped them out again, kind of like similar to the Bronze Age collapse. Like right when ancient Greece was just about to blossom into this new golden era of Athenian-led world domination and like Renaissance, they got snuffed out. They had a world war and they got wiped out completely, only to be replaced 100 years by Alexander the Great, who was a Thessalonian, not even a Greek, who was like a barbarian, a thug, who wasn't civilized at all, and like he would just go in and wipe and kill everybody in a village, kind of like the Scythian way to deal with things, and like the Mongols, and then unified everybody and took over Persia to try to take over Persia so they wouldn't take them over. So I mean, they did, but there was no literature coming out of that period. The only literature was Aristotle. Aristotle was Alexander the Great's tutor. He was played by Anthony Hopkins in the movie. But that's it. Aristotle was it. And then after that, it was like 200 more years before you started to get writers coming out of Rome in the 1st century. So it was like one generation. But anyway, so that's why, see, like some people would compare the Peloponnesian Wars with World War I and World War II because they were world wars. But I compare the Peloponnesian War to the Napoleonic Wars, because Napoleon, France, because America became a democracy when they broke from England, France was like, okay, it's our turn. They had their French Revolution, where they straight up cut the heads off of their king and queen and tried to become a democracy. And that's when Napoleon led an army to take over all of Europe. It was like a world war. Like it was the biggest European war since Charlemagne, the most famous guy trying to unify it all. And the Napoleonic Wars had so much power and strength was because the French people themselves were motivated. That generation of French were so fired up about living in a democracy that they were willing to all fight for it. And that's why, like, Napoleon tried to take over Russia. He hiked all the way to Moscow, and they were winning all of their battles. And people like to say that it was Napoleon's genius, which is why they were winning their battles. But another reason why they were winning their battles was because they were better warriors, because they were all of one mind, fighting for something they believed in. Maybe the people they were fighting against knew that they wished they were French, because France was more liberal than they were, so they weren't fighting as much or something, desert more. And so it was the same thing with the Peloponnesian War. When Athenians went out to war, they were proud of it. Donald Kagan mentioned that there was some like random village somewhere in like Attica, where Athens, the country of Athens, which was the biggest of the city-states. It was like 40,000 square kilometers or something. Anyway, that they had this plaque of all the people who died, and like the plaque showed the people who died in like 30 different battles throughout locations throughout the Greek world. So they were like proud of that. Like it was showing how they were part of this huge Greek world. And for people in those days, in the days of Iron Age, the idea, especially if it was just in their legendary time, just a couple generations before, where it was just Iron Age, for them to contemplate that they could lived in this world that was so big that they could go and travel off all the way to Egypt if they wanted to be a trader or something like that, or be a scholar. It's fascinating to them, and it's motivating, and they're kind of like a brave new world, like, oh my God, look at what humans can do. And so that's what motivated people to spread, and for the Athenians to fight. And so that's basically the 30,000-foot view of the Peloponnesian War. But at the end, Athens lost the war, because Athens couldn't get the other people on their side. They were joining Sparta, and because Athens was abusing the people who they had control over, and they were like exercising genocide over the people. There was this one island called the Miletus, and Athens wanted to take them over, and Miletus was like, why? And Athens like, because we can. It's called the Miletan dialogue. And then Athens, and so it's kind of like a might makes right argument, and like the original might makes right, and so it's like, it's us contemplating if that's actually the best way to go about things, because that might makes right is the general mantra philosophy of Bronze Age, just fighters. And so Athens was a democracy, and democracies are supposed to give equal say to all the people in their country. And so if you're trying to spread your democracy, which gives all say to all people in your country, that would in turn mean that you would be giving all say to all people in your empire as well. And so why would you use that might makes right argument if you're spreading democracy? You're being a hypocrite. It's an oxymoron. And so I think that's what the Miladians were trying to say, like, well, don't we get a say? Because you guys are a democracy within your own country, and you're trying to put us in your country, then we get to be a type of citizen, right? And they're like, no, we make all the decisions. And so they fought, and they killed everybody on Miletus, all the men, and they turned all the women and children into slaves. So Athens didn't completely figure out democracy. They didn't completely figure out the proper enlightened way to have a political system that gave proper say to the people they were taking over. I mean, they were being hypocrites. If you're going to be a democracy in your country, you have to spread that, or else people aren't going to go on your side. And so they weren't on their side because they were too stuck in the old ways of Bronze Age might makes right, and Sparta won. It's kind of very similar to when America went independent from England. They didn't have representative government. The Boston Tea Party, England wanted to tax the tea, but we didn't get to vote on it. So we were like, all right, well then why are we part of your empire if we're not voting? I mean, what, only people in your country get to vote? So it's kind of similar to like an aristocracy, like you get to vote, but only the rich. But Athens was was a full democracy. Everybody got to vote. And so that's basically what happened. Athens Athens got ahead of their skis. They got too. They didn't think things through, and so that basically, see, the Peloponnesian War is basically an argument between what's the best form of government: aristocracy, which is what Sparta was, or democracy, which is what Athens was. And they were like, well, let them fight it out and see what happens. Oh, looks like Sparta wins. I guess aristocracy is best. So Athens would have been a lot better off. See, this is proof right here that straight democracy isn't what you want. If you're going to make a straight democracy, what you do need to do right away is you need to write laws. You can't just have the laws created by whoever is making the democracy now, because that means the laws are going to be subject to whoever's around now. What if there's like a war or a plague, or a famine, and all the people who are alive now suddenly die off, and the only ones who survive are like the farmers who aren't as educated, but because they live in a democracy, everything goes to what the people who are alive now. But the people who are alive now weren't educated like the ones before who were running a healthy democracy because they were educated. Now they're just selfish and they're uneducated and they're rude farmers, and so then it just turns into an aristocracy where it's us versus them. So if you're ever going to have a democracy where everybody gets to vote, you have to have a very long list of laws and rules that you then solidify into like set in stone that could then outlive all of the people who are alive, so that it's like a hard drive that saves all of the best parts of all the citizens who ever lived, and as a shining example, so that in case in the future you have like a generation of retards because they all got poisoned by lead in the water, or they're repopulating from a population collapse, and there just aren't enough scholars around. At least they have a bunch of laws to look to follow, of people, the wise ones before, and so the best form of government is a democratic elected republic, and that's why Rome did so well, because they had their 10 tablets, they wrote down their laws, and they voted on their leaders in their Senate of 300 to 400 to 600 people who were educated, who then controlled, but they didn't allow it to become a raw democracy, because it was only educated people who were making the decisions. And that was the Rome that took over. So I think that's the best way to run a government, until of course you have technology which allows everybody to be educated, and then you can grow up to be a full democracy, gradually full democracy, as the populace proves themselves to be smart enough. Luckily, because America is a republic, we have these laws we can follow, even though somehow we have a generation of retards right now. I think we have a generation of retards in America right now because it's a bunch of baby boomers who are spoiled brats who never had to work for anything, so they're like retarded. And then it's a bunch of like millennials who grew up in like a decadent society where everything was like just moving along without anybody wondering why. It was just perfect, but nobody knew why. Who are all just recently started smoking weed. I think everybody's high off their ass. And I think everybody has to, once everybody realizes it becomes more infused in society, people will, and all the people's open minds, because we're all like learning all these new things, figuring out new things, I think it'll all settle down in like 5 years. Our collective IQ is going to go up about 20%, 20 points. in the next 5 years after we persecute and expose Fox News and Trump and all those guys. But anyway, so that's why democracy had a really bad reputation. And democracy had a bad reputation mainly because Athens tried to take over Syracuse. And that was seen as a democratic caused event. And like the invasion of Syracuse was seen and historically as the stupidest decision ever. Like that made no sense whatsoever. Everything about it makes no sense. Why you would do it makes no sense. Well, why you would do it barely makes any sense. Makes a little bit and doesn't make much sense. How they went about doing it makes no sense. And the logistics was like, makes no sense, and how they organized it. And it was all because of the democracy. So, and that is what wiped out Athens and caused Athens to lose. And so, so basically what happened with the Sicilian expedition, that was like towards the end of the war. Because like what I want to do with my timeline is plug generations into it. Like Strauss and Howe with their Generations book. They made generations from like the 1450s. I think the Arthurian generation was the first. And then it ends with the baby boomers, Generation X, Millennial, Generation Z. And so like one generation is the parent of two generations after. So baby boomers are the parents of the millennials, and Generation X are the parents of the Zs. And they go in 4 different cycles. But to explain that with ancient Greece would be fascinating because the Greek people at the end of the war were different from the Greek people at the beginning. And to just analyze how the generations changed, the mentality changed, why people did stuff because of this collective conscious that they had because they were part of a generation, and then why the other generation did it differently. And then like for example, the playwright, I can't remember his name, the main playwright, Peloponnesian or whatever. He lived 90 years. He lived from 495 until 405, and so he got to witness the rise and fall of Greek civilization. The main playwright, the main tragedian. What's his name? Let's see if it's here. Not Herodotus. He died in 405. Euripides. No, that's another one. Euripides lasted 75 years. But there was another one, and for some reason I can't find him, but he lived for 90 years. And so he was 5 years old when the Battle of Marathon happened. Now, you remember something when you're 5. That's something that you'll remember like it was yesterday for the rest of your life. You won't remember something that when you were 4, but when you're 5. I was 6 when I moved to Boulder. And I remember I could talk to you for hours about my life in Austin. And a lot of that was from when I was 5. So, but I don't remember 4. I think I was like 4 when we moved to Westlake Hills, and I don't remember living in town. And so, but I remember everything about when I was 5, like my perceptions of things, events happening. You know, I remember who president was, which TV shows were on, what time they were on, all that stuff, just like an adult. And so, you know, the playwright, whatever his freaking name is, god damn it. Why can't I find it? I could have sworn, because he died in 405, and he lived for 90 years, or whatever. The main playwright. So he remembered when the Greeks kicked the Persians' asses. He remembers Marathon. He remembers the story of Philippides. He grew up with that. And then he remembers all of the golden age of Greece until the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. And then he died at the age of 90, 1 year before the Peloponnesian War ended in 404. He died in 405. So he died probably as a fully, because he was a smart guy, he probably died in a fall, tripping over something. That's how they usually died in those days. As a fully cognizant old man, like 1 year before Athens. So he probably knew Athens. He probably thought Athens was going to get just completely snuffed out, like burnt to the ground and sowed with salt when he died. So he saw Athens defeat the Persians, go through their entire golden age, and then just about to get killed all in one lifetime. They should make a movie about that guy. But that's like, but a lot of people, saw that kind of stuff, and there was just so many changes. So at the beginning of the war, there were all these like really smart people. Here, I'll even do we'll do just a really quick order of things that happened in the Peloponnesian War. So first, like they were sending out, they created a colony called Tilissos in the 400s. That's one, and then some other ones. So they were sending out a lot of colonies, and they sent out a colony called Megalopolis, and it was the first colony that the Greeks sent out, where every different or multiple different city-states contributed to the colony. It wasn't just, because usually until then every colony was sent out by one city. So you'd have like Corinth, and then there was the Corinthian baby city, and then even Corinthian baby city, I think it was like Thalessa, would then send out a colony themselves, and you would have like granddaughter colonies. But Megalopolis, which literally means central city, was the first one that was donated by a bunch of different people from the Greek world. They were becoming a Greek world. But Athens had 10% of them, so they had the most. So the Athenians there got in an argument and tried to become hegemonic for Athens and cause some problems. But anyway, so then in 400s they made another amphitheater in Gira, Dion statue. So then in the year 430 they had the plague, which was only 1 year after the war started. And so they had this leader called Pericles, who was the leader of Athens he wasn't like the official leader because they were a democracy, but he was like the de facto leader. And a lot of people said Athens, I think Thucydides himself, who was the 5th general from Athens, like the 5th richest. See, that's the cool thing about Thucydides. Thucydides was, because they elected 5 generals, I think it was like 6 generals to lead the war, and Thucydides was one of them. So he was like the 5th most powerful person in Athens, richest, most powerful general in Athens. It was the same dude who wrote the book. And so you get into the head of the actual players, This isn't a book like it was similar to, I guess, Julius Caesar wrote his own book. But, so it's really cool because you really get into the heads and you know what their limitations and everything. But, and Thucydides was really smart. I think Thucydides is starting to take over. Let's just do a really quick aside on Thucydides, and then I'll go through the order of stuff that happened. But Thucydides is starting to take over as like the father of history. When I grew up, Herodotus was seen as the father of history, and Herodotus and Thucydides actually met each other. Thucydides went to a Herodotarian recital and got motivated to write his book. But Herodotus was like a historian who writes about the whole world and mainly the Assyrian empire. But Herodotus, like, said, got a lot of his information about the world from secondhand, like at the pub, and he said a lot of stupid stuff. Like, Herodotus said that black men have black semen, so which actually tells you there weren't a lot of black people in the Roman world. If they thought that, if it was common knowledge, everybody's reading them, black people have black semen. He said that there were like dog-sized ants in India. He said that troglodytes in in Morocco, lived in caves and like dug for roots for food. He said a lot of interesting stuff too, but he said stuff that just doesn't, you'd have to be kind of stupid to believe. He was telling, what else did he say? Apart from the black, he said something else, which, he said a lot of cool stories, but it was mainly about the whole world and stuff that doesn't make sense even now. I can't remember, but so he wasn't like a first-hand historian, geopolitical, and so you can't really take anything from it. It's more like a series of tales. It's kind of like you can throw it in the box of all those other second-hand stories. But Thucydides, is actually painting a whole world of something that actually happened, and he described all these battles. I think there were 13 battles that made it onto Wikipedia that are on the Peloponnesian War with like really long articles, because Thucydides described everything that happened there. And so that's why, like, generals, like they said that Alexander the Great had a book of Thucydides underneath his pillow as he was taking over the world, because he wanted to read about the battles and everything. There's my roommate again. Generals read Thucydides. If you go to West Point, every single person who goes to West Point has to read Thucydides because he describes all the battles and stuff. So it was really cool. But they had a leader in Athens called Pericles, who was a leader for like 25 years. And Thucydides was saying that he didn't even, this is what Donald Kagan said, Thucydides didn't think that Athens was a real democracy. He thought it was a tyranny already because of Pericles. So maybe he didn't like Pericles, but like, that's the problem with democracies. Like, a democracy is only going to work if the people who are alive at that time are all like living in a healthy society and all contributing. I think it was Kagan who said that when they had their democratic assemblies in Athens, 20,000 people in Attica, the country of Athens, were able to vote because it was a full-blown democracy as long as you owned land. So I guess there were 20,000 men. I guess women didn't vote. But at any given time, you could fill up like 5,000 people in the agora, in their forum. It's big enough to hold 5,000 if you want to know how big it needed to be. Which also is about how big a Roman legion is, 4,800. So that's about how many people you can kind of communicate with and have everybody hear you and get the word get around and move as a unit. It's about 5,000 is the max. When Jesus gave his speech on the Mount, it was to 5,000 people. My college was 4,000 people, so it's kind of like a lot of city-states are kind of like that. The Spartan army could usually field like about that many armies. So anyway, because that's about how many people could make it there, because there were usually people had work to do. And but of the 5,000 people, anybody could chime in equally, because it was a full democracy, and people would vote with yes or no, like with black or white stones. And when they ostracized people, everybody had equal vote. They would write somebody's name down, and whoever got the most of their name put in would get ostracized. But even when you would have that whole 5,000 people in there, voting, he said that only like a dozen people would speak. I can't remember what he said. And he asked this class to guess why, and some kid was like, because they're afraid. And he's like, yeah, because people don't eat, because they were afraid to look stupid. And so even in a democracy, a full democracy, it's still going to be taken over by like the rich, like central cool kids, you know, the confident people and stuff. And so that's why like a full democracy without a written set of laws is like just really ephemeral. It's like a bubble floating, just about to pop. And so that's why it's important to like study the different generations and the mindset of the generations, because if you wipe out a generation, then you're going to get a completely different form of government that comes after that. It's not going to be a democracy anymore. It's going to be like people trying to create a democracy, but it won't, you know, because it was able to be a democracy because they had such affluence and such excitement after defeating the Persians that they were just like, let's do this, and all these new discoveries and stuff. So that's why you had like Pericles, who was like the exemplar of this generation. I think, and he was the leader for 25 years. But then, and he had this philosophy, and he was the one who kind of motivated them to get started in the Peloponnesian War in the first place, because he had this philosophy that Athens could build this huge wall around their city. And so they were fascinated with the technology of the wall, because in the Bronze Age, which is what they came out of, nobody could breach a big-ass wall because they didn't have the technology for it. So if you could get rich enough to build a big-ass wall, well, there you are, and you're right next to the ocean, and your wall goes to the ocean, and you have an empire who can defeat you. They could camp outside your wall, but then you could just go inside your wall and stay alive that way. And so that's what Pericles was just trying to protect everybody, and just not trying to be too aggressive towards Sparta, by just saying, hey, why don't we just retreat behind the wall if we piss off Sparta? And so Sparta and Athens originally got into squabbles because Sparta, they had like a rebellion from Helots, those slaves that they had. And then they, for some reason, they allowed a bunch of the Helots to leave and create a city-state somewhere else, because it was just a bad group of Helots who they just wanted to get rid of so they wouldn't have to deal with them. And they just expected the Helots to go like far away, but the Athenians, because they thought the Helots would just scatter, and then they would forget about them, you know. But the problem was Athens gave Megara to the Helots. Athens like defeated, was having problems with Corinth, and they gave they just let them all move in together in one unit into a city-state that was on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, like right next to Corinth, which was in the area that Sparta already controlled. So now they had a city-state of people who hated them, who rebelled against them, who were living inside their actual country, because Sparta they had their slaves called the Helots, which were around their original city-state. But then they created a hegemony, which is kind of like a mini empire, where they controlled all of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. So they controlled all the semi-independent city-states around there, like Mantinea, and even Olympia was more independent, but that's in the Peloponnesian. And so that they could kind of create a buffer zone around Athens. And the Athens would fight for themselves, but they'd never really travel. When they went to Anabasis, Xenophon, when they went all the way into the Middle East, they did that because they were paid like extra for it. And that was like the first time they did it. But so they were like really pissed off at Athens for that. They were like, oh, that's like disrespectful. But from Athens' point of view, It was just a group of people. They were settling, and people didn't like Sparta anyway. And Athens kind of felt like everybody would side with them and just kick Sparta out and defeat Sparta, because Sparta was from this old aristocratic, Bronze Age aristocratic oppressive society that was anti civilization. They didn't read, they didn't write, they weren't using gold coins. I mean, it was anti. They had slaves, and they were just thugs. And so Sparta didn't like that. And then there was an argument with one of the, I think, Megalopolis, the one of the colonies. And then there was the Athens killed everybody in Miletus, and so then Sparta kind of felt like they could have a leg up and just snuff out Athens, so that they could protect themselves, so the Athens would try to take them over. So Sparta went to attack Athens, and Athens brought all of their people in from the countryside, and they mushroomed their city up to 300,000 people. And because Pericles thought he was so smart that they could do that, but he didn't think things through, that they only had one fountain that was like up on the Acropolis or something, that had to give water to all these people, and in like one little like river. And so nobody had water. And so then a plague came from one of the boats, which they probably could have taken care of, but they were all squished in there with no water, and the plague broke out and just killed everybody. 1/3 to 2/3 of the people in Athens, and which was 75,000 to 100,000 people, and then it ended up, and then Pericles was like the great leader, so he was like walking around blessing people and trying to be, a man of the streets. So then he eventually got sick, and then he eventually died, and this was in 430, 1 year after the actual war started. And then his son died, and his grandson actually got like executed and for like doing bad in a war. So so that whole so they had a system. Athens had a really cool like constitution that I think Aristotle wrote about, the Athenian and the Spartan constitution, like comparing them both. And like they would give you enough time to speak, like how much they drill like a 1/4 hole in the bottom of a 1/4 inch hole in the bottom of like a gallon jug, and they give you like 10 minutes for the water to come out. Once the water was out, you couldn't speak your point in the court anymore. And they had this system called ostracization, where people would vote, and you would have to leave for 10 years. The cities had to go for 20 years, but then you could come back, like you were never left. And it was like a cool thing to keep people from becoming too powerful, And Rome had lots of fancy ways to do that too. Like they had a law that said if you held an office, it was like around the same time, the 400s, 410 or something, that you couldn't hold that same office for another 10 years. And then they had age limits for offices. You have to be 30. And we adopted a lot of that. But the problem was, like, if you go a generation ahead and everybody's a thug, they would use those laws, like the ostracization laws, to, like, just do conscriptions, kill people they don't like, or ostracize people they don't like. So, like, Pericles dies, and then all these other people die, and then they die in a lot of battles. So then has to kind of become a new generation of people who are coming up, and they're not as smart. And so that second generation were the ones who did the Sicilian invasion, which was like the stupidest thing ever, because Syracuse, Sicily, was the biggest Greek-speaking, and they were like Dorians, Greek-speaking colony, like city in all of the Greek world, bigger than Athens, and they were a democracy. Like, they did have at the time, like they did have a tyrant of Syracuse there, Plato. Almost got killed by their tyrant there, but he lived there for a while. But they were a democracy. So why would a democracy take over a democracy, another democracy? Because they figured if they could, then they would have like control, total control over the Mediterranean. But they didn't think things through because it was too democratic. Rome had a thing called a dictator, where you would give, it was like the general, you would get all the power, and so it's like the army moves with one head. But when they went to Sicily, they had 3 generals, and one of the main generals, Nicias, didn't even want to be there. He was trying to argue against it. And so when he got there, he didn't even want to fight when he got there. They were just kind of hanging out, like, what are we going to do? Like, maybe if we don't fight, we'll go back to Athens. You know, they were led by a guy who wanted to just go back to Athens. And so, and when they got there, they didn't do enough communication. The city that first asked them to go out there, because they had some stupid squabble with Syracuse, and so they're like, oh, okay, that's our excuse. They went out to help them. They lied about how much money they had. They actually didn't have any money to help them. And then other people who supposedly helped them didn't even let them in the gate. They just didn't want to help them, so they should have just gone back immediately. So because 45,000 Athenians rowed out in like all these triremes, and only one boat had horses. They only had like 30 horses. And not a single person came back. They all went out to take over Syracuse, 45,000 and like 200 triremes, and they all just died. All of them. Like, this guy was giving a lecture, and he said that then they left to all this fanfare, like, yay, and everybody left for, like, this is the problem with democracy. Everybody left for selfish reasons. They all thought they were going to get rich off of taking over the world and getting slaves and all that kind of stuff, and a great adventure. And they got lucky when they went there because there was no storm or anything, and it was all great fanfare. And then like a year later, they got a message from a boat saying, hey, we need more people. It's not going well. And then after that, like a year later, there was some there was a trader getting his hair cut because they didn't hear anything from it again. And they were like, what happened? And the guy getting his hair cut told the story. They were like, oh yeah, they all got killed in the river. So like their whole army left, 45,000 people. They get one message, hey, we're having trouble, send more people. They send a bunch more people, no more word, nothing. They don't know our area or anything. That must have been so freaky for the Athenians. And then they realized they didn't have any more they didn't have any boats left to do trade because they sent all their boats out to Sicily. So then that's when the Spartans came in, and here there are a lot of really interesting characters in this story, archetypes for people, because this is kind of like the beginning of civilization. This type of person, extreme person, and so they had this like lunatic called Alcibiades, who was like a rich kid in the days of Athens. He was kind of like Caligula. His father died in war, and so he was raised by like his relatives, but his father was like he was from like the top rich family, so he was raised traumatized from people because his own family died, own father died, but with slaves who he could boss around, like Donald Trump. So he turned on to this, but he went to a bunch of battles and wars, so he was a really good fighter and a general and everything, but he was like damaged and a narcissist, like your classic narcissist. And I guess Donald Kagan told the story that like he punched somebody in the face, and the guy's like, why did you do that? And he goes, because I can. And then another time, he was used to having people tell stories about him all the time because he was like the guy who would break all the rules. And so once he cut his dog's tail off because he wanted people to talk about that, just to have something to talk about. And so it was Alcibiades who talked all of the Athenians into taking over Syracuse, because he was like, he wanted glory, and he talked everybody into glory. But then when they couldn't take over Syracuse, and they were going to recall him to like execute him for making the stupid decision, because that's what they did, he instead of being like an upstanding citizen, because he's a chicken hawk, he's like Donald Trump, a chicken shit, blusterer, narcissist, he went to the Spartans and told the Spartans all of the Athenian secrets, and told the Spartans that if they wanted to take over Athens, all they had to do was build a fort right next to Athens. Like that's what the Turks did, I think. When they took over Constantinople, you just built a fort next to them, and you turned the besieged into the besieged. And so, that's what they did. The Spartans built a big old fort, and they just stayed there year round, and forced the Athenians into their inside, and then beat them at battle because they didn't have any more ships, and then forced them to tear away 2 miles of their wall so that they could go in and take them over. So then, but then Alcibiades, I guess, was having sex, of course, with the king's wife. So he had to run off to the Persians because he was going to get killed by the Spartans, and became like a spy. Told the Persians all of the Greek secrets. So he was just I guess that's maybe an example of the worst citizen, the type of person who could turn a democracy into a tyranny. So, so Sparta took over Athens, and so what happened was, because Sparta won the war, and Athens already had this like empire, and they had this Greek empire, and Sparta won the war because they figured out boats. Like the big question at the beginning of the war was, well, whoever wins this war is whoever, like, if the Athenians can figure out land warfare first, or if the Spartans can figure out sea warfare first. Because the Spartans were the best at land warfare because they were professional athletes. Like that's all they did was train. So they were just stronger, more disciplined, everything. Crazier, warriors, all that. Like the way the stories of Spartans. Like if you were deformed at all, you get just thrown. The baby just gets thrown to the wolves. Every boy at the age of 6 for like 3 months had to live by himself in the mountains, naked, just hunting. And then they had to like travel the countryside, like living off of thievery. And if they got caught, they get punished. But if they didn't get caught, they were supposed to be thieves. And so it was just, and they trained like jumping up, and how many times you could jump up and hit your heels against your butt in a minute. Like the women did that, and the women trained alongside the men as warriors, because when the men went off to travel, the women were left there to try to have to defend the city against the Helots. If there was a rebellion, the women would have to fight. And so the women were fed the same food and the same exact training regimen as the men, alongside the men, since they were kids, naked. They were all naked. And only they had like really strict, like if one guy's wife couldn't get pregnant, his friend would get her pregnant, because they were, to keep their populations high. They were always trying to keep their populations up so they could fight off the Helots. But what happened was, because Athens lost all their boats, Sparta figured out boats, and they defeated the Athenians like in a boat battle. But and then the Athenians beat the Spartans in the war. And Sparta did not completely raze Athens to the ground like they could have, because they were afraid of the Thebans. They didn't like the Thebans. The Thebans were a democracy too, and they figured that if they did that, the Thebans would just move in and take over Athens. So what Sparta did was try to turn Athens into a tyranny, just like Sparta. So they tore down the walls, because Sparta didn't believe in walls. They thought, they had a saying, their men or their wall, and the tip of their spear was the boundary. So Sparta installed 30 tyrants. to control Athens, to try to turn Athens into a tyranny like Sparta. And then Sparta basically adopted the Athenian, the remnants of the Athenian empire, because there was already kind of that going on. And so Sparta would send out and so Sparta originally never wanted to be an empire. They're a Bronze Age city-state. Their whole MO has nothing to do with empire. Like, their rules were, if they were to go out on a war, they wouldn't chase you very far. They'd get out and they'd get you out of their territory, and then they'd come back, because they did not want to leave for too long, because their helots would do a rebellion against their women. And so it was a Bronze Age philosophy. All they cared about was their awesome life of being professional athletes. They only cared about their 10,000 people. They didn't care about empire. But all of a sudden, because they took over Athens, it was like somebody handed them an empire on a golden platter, on a silver platter. Not just the empire, but inside of a world that was ripe for empire, because they were all colonizing Greeks who spoke the same language. And so the Spartans sent out hegemonic leaders, representatives of the empire, the Spartan Empire. But they were Spartans, so they had the Spartan attitude, like, we're better than you, and they didn't have a philosophy about empire, because they were just, all they knew was how are we going to keep the control for ourselves, and that didn't work, so that just dissolved. That's like passing off a business to somebody who doesn't know how to run a business. And so, which then pissed off, it made everybody hate Sparta, because they were abusing everybody. And then people started to, the Helots started to rebel more, because Sparta was going to be on its way out anyway, whether they snuffed out Athens or not, and they happened to snuff out Athens, and that's the whole problem. That's the whole Greek tragedy. Greek really did do a tragedy. It was the tragedy of Athens, right when they were supposed to turn into a democracy. It was like, here's the Greek world, like that. It was gone as soon as it started. So Sparta, basically it ended up hurting Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, because they didn't have, their population was knocked way down from all those battles, and they weren't repopulating it as much. And so they're having to probably allow Helots to become Spartans and allow immigrants to become Spartans, and they were kind of losing the discipline and the legacy also of Spartan families. Are getting just all Spartan families are getting killed out completely, and people are trying to adopt a culture. They're like posers. It's not their own parents who are the Spartans, because they died. They're trying to adopt a culture that lived before, that's not appropriate for now. Kind of like Arnold Schwarzenegger taking over The Apprentice. It was a stupid show to begin with, and he's only doing it because it's popular, and they might as well see where it goes now. But of course, it didn't work, so it didn't last long. So the Thebans decided that they were going to train really hard too, because they figured out that if we train all the time, we can be fighters like Spartans. We don't have to have slaves. We could be pretty much as strong. So the Thebans actually beat the Spartans in a hoplite battle in 371, Spartan on Thebe, the actual Spartans, for the first time. So people were like, oh, you can beat Spartans, they're not that badass. And so then they lost self-confidence, and then they lost prestige, and then by the time when King Philip of Macedon came down to take over the Greeks, they had their big battle, Pharsalus or something. No, wait, I can't remember the name of the battle, where all the Greek city-states brought people up to try to fight Philip. Spartans didn't even have an army there. By then, in the 350s BC or whenever it was, when 360s, like a decade or two after Spartan lost their big battle against Thebes, like they were all like, that was it. Like their populations had shrunk enough they couldn't get it up, and they couldn't even field an army. And then Philip takes over Greece, and Sparta by then gets taken over by the Helots, and it's just another city-state. So that's how Sparta died, so Sparta would have been much better off if they had have not been so aggressive towards Athens, and they had have just mind their own business on their little island, and allowed Athens to have their empire, and then gradually make Sparta a democracy. I mean, there would have been a war anyway, but if they had smart philosophers, the philosophers could have said, let the Spartans be Spartans because they loved their life. It's an awesome situation. The Spartans who are alive now, you're never going to change them. But what we should do is sow seeds into the Spartan children, so that the Spartan children, once they're adults, they're a little bit more democratic, and once their kids are adults, then they give equal rights to the Helots, and they're not Sparta anymore, But to change the political system of Sparta to something where you don't have all these slaves, because it was 10 to 1. There were 10 slaves to every Spartan who could just kill a Helot if they wanted to. That was major extreme. And if you could just convince them that wasn't going to last, Sparta could have been snuffed out. But I mean, they were going to get snuffed out anyway. But yeah, they should have been less aggressive, and Athens should have been less aggressive against Sparta. Not understanding Sparta, and also less aggressive and less hypocritical towards the people they were taking over. And so the way that you could plug that into now is that modern day Sparta is like the Republicans, because they only believe in an elite few, like smart people who are only they are smart enough to control everybody else, who are all idiots. I saw Sam Cedar on Patrick Bet David, just clips of it, because Sam Cedar had these little clips, and Sam Cedar was saying that Social Security was good because it's the most popular program. And the Republicans are trying to get rid of Social Security because they don't believe in equal rights for everybody. So Patrick Bet David goes, well, just because something's the most popular doesn't make it right. That's like saying, hey, in high school, hey, free weed for everybody, and then you're popular. How does that make it right? And then his friend's like, yeah, man, and repeats the same thing. And so that's the mentality that people don't know what's right for them. Like my college advisor told me I wasn't allowed to choose my major because I didn't know what was right for me, even though I was 19, Those are people who don't believe in democracy. And so, and they're racist. They don't think that immigrants know better or stuff like that. So Spartans are kind of like the Republicans, and the Democrats are like the Athenians of the democracy. And so if you wanted to learn from the lessons of the Peloponnesian War, and do the things that they should have done right to make it right and plug that into now, I would say now what you would do is explain to the Republicans, the proper place to be strong and like willed, and then the proper situation to be democratic. It's kind of like in spiral dynamics. You have all these different levels of consciousness, just me, selfish, and then it's just my family, and then it's just my ethnic group, and then it's the whole world. But and we all go through that individually as well as a society. But as you're going through that, you always keep a remnant of that with you forever. And so we need to, make a society that honors, might makes right and strength. And so that would be like the sports. But also at the same time give opportunity to everybody. So encourage everybody to do like YouTube videos and stuff. And yeah, but and to allow everybody to speak their mind, because that's not what the Athenians do. And if you don't do that, you're going to piss everybody off. So don't ban books. Like you could make a line of things like, don't do today. Yeah, so just you need to give people freedom, basically, across the board. And you also need to follow the law. See, that's another thing that the Republicans are trying to do. The only thing that can destroy a democratic republic is if you stop following the laws. And we're the oldest country in the world. Our Constitution was from like 1781 or something. 1776 was our Declaration, and then in 81 we made our Constitution. And then after that, all the other countries in the world model their Constitution off of us. And we're the original one. We're the oldest country in the world. If you look at a country in terms of a consistent form of government. And so if we're so old, you need to honor the oldest laws, And so to suddenly, all of a sudden, give immunity to a president just because he's a president when we never did that, and bringing it back to like the times of the king who's above the law, that's uneducated. That's the reason people do think that stuff is because they're not intellectual. We're living in a world of decadence where there's rich people are controlling the narrative with their money, paying people, giving people a boost up to then just spread their own story, which is the same exact thing as telling you you don't get one, because I'm telling you. Like Tucker Carlson making up stories. And now Fox is actually getting sued for lying. And like Ben Shapiro posing as a intellectual when he got his start, getting funded by billionaires for making anti-abortion videos. If you look at his very first video, it's just a stupid anti-abortion video. And now he's just a mouthpiece for Donald Trump and the fascists. And so if you wanted to fix that, what you need to do is support the arts and encourage people, and even set up programs that would pay people. That's what my whole bike school is all about. To talk about the classics and to create a new, solidify a whole world civilization of this contiguous conversation, because that's basically what our history of literature is. It's a bunch of select few intellectuals who are having a conversation with each other. Now, the dead people can't talk to the live people, but the live people can talk to all of the dead people. And all the alive people have been talking to all the dead people as you study history. That's what Montesquieu's all about, the book. He's just one big book referencing all of the political theorists. And so, if you want to have a healthy society, you would encourage the highest number of people to have the highest level of political discourse, which is talking about what all of the people in history talked about. So you have to be a historian. You have to talk about all the different positions. And so to get that to the next level, I think we need to really add the plug-in generations to the different historical stories and people, and so that we can look at them through the eyes of the individual people and how they were raised and why they thought the way they were, and also attach different personalities to the different players, figure them out as people and say, that guy's good, that guy's bad, you want to be like him, you don't want to be like him, you don't want to be like that country, you want to be like that country, and to actually judge it. Because if we were to do that, the general level of intelligence of the conversation and the political arguments that we would be having to make the laws for things would be so much higher. We wouldn't be sitting around making stories up, saying saying, like, did you see what Donald Trump Jr. said? He's like, this is the same thing as what Biden's doing is the same thing as the worst dictators ever, like Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot. Like he has no knowledge of history. Donald Trump himself, the President of the United States, thought that when we were fighting our war for independence, we had to protect the airports. There were airports in the 1770s that we had to protect from the British, and that we need to be careful for the Mexicans because of our border with that Colorado has with Mexico. He didn't. What else did he say? Just one fib after another. And then the other day, with his other like presidential bid, like yesterday after he got arrested, indicted, Donald Trump is saying that Joe Biden is so senile and retarded that he addressed one member of a country, leader of a country, as though he was the leader of another country. And Joe Biden, there's nothing senile about Joe Biden. He's totally with it. The reason that they're saying it's projection. Donald Trump is so retarded he can barely put a two sentence together. So they're like, oh well, then let's say the same thing about Biden because he's older than Trump. And so yeah, it's and that's the level of politics we're at now. We have Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert think we live in a Christian country and that it's written in our Constitution that we're a Christian country. And they're elected officials. When it's actually written in our Constitution, the very first amendment is that we're not a Christian country. So, like nobody reads the people in power don't read our 36-page Constitution. Like one time, and the Trump, not one time. They asked Donald Trump, our president, what his favorite Bible verse was, and he said, oh, there's so many of them, he can't name them. You know, just like the time when Katie Couric asked Sarah Palin where she gets her news from, and she says she gets it from so many different news sources she can't remember one because there's so many of them. So it's like that movie Manchurian Candidate with Meryl Streep. I never saw it, but I saw a section where she's giving this just really empty, bland speech of just word salad nonsense. That's what Donald Trump does. Only he's retarded. Like he'll say stuff. Donald Trump said that if he was president, he would end the war in one day by just giving half of Ukraine to Russia, and then that would be good. But he did give half of Ukraine to Russia. He gave the best part of it. He gave the Crimea to Russia, and then he wanted all of Ukraine. And this is coming from a guy who everybody knows was going to be given a Trump Tower in Moscow. And all of his money comes from Putin, because his own son, Eric Trump, told the golf journalist on the golf course that that's where their money comes from. And he tried to bribe, he got impeached for bribing the president of Ukraine because he didn't want to give him the weapons. And so he thinks that if you just give Ukraine, that's his solution, or else you're going to get World War III. Because the Russians have, so basically what Trump's saying is just let the Russians have whatever they want, because if you don't, they're going to kill us all with their nuclear weapons. So what, same thing with just let China and Russia, and yeah, that's because he doesn't believe in democracy. Maybe he'll be installed as the puppet dictator of America, and all these Americans don't even know. So you could alleviate all of that by giving some kind of encouragement, incentive to people to talk about history. And so I commend Kay and Ben, that's his name, for encouraging me to do a video about the Peloponnesian War, because more people need to talk about the politics of the past and what caused wars, because it's the same exact thing as what's happening now. You have the people who are into democracy, who think that they should spread it and have a really strong desire to do that, and meaning rights for everybody, including the people out around the world, especially now because we're more developed than we were then. But then you have the other people who are stuck in the past, who only want to protect their own lives and their own selves, and they will fight. And so if you want to get to the next level, you have to describe what the next level even is. And you have to follow the law. And so that's basically my rendition of the Peloponnesian War, because like one thing about the Peloponnesian War that shocked Thucydides is how quickly society can just evaporate. Like how quickly people can just go back to the Dark Ages. Like, the Romans, the Greeks, they came right out of the Dark Ages. But, and so they thought they were all, civilized and everything. But then next thing I knew, like, in one war, like fathers were killing their own sons. In one battle they went in and they killed everybody in a village, including all of the children in a school, which makes no sense because everybody speaks the same language. They're all one people. Why would you snuff out the future? If you snuff out the future, there's no people you're going to get the Dark Ages in the future. It should be obvious. Yet they're just going around and murdering everybody. Now, some other interesting things about the war that I forgot to mention, which are just interesting tidbits, is like they had a war that one of the things that started the war was that Athens got their asses kicked in Greece. They lost like 200 triremes. But at one point, they drug like 200 triremes back because they would refurbish them. Triremes were like impossible to take care of, like really expensive. They almost bankrupted the entire country of Athens by building 200 triremes. And they were extremely expensive to maintain. And this guy who wrote the book, like had it all figured out economically. It was really cool. But they lost one battle, or they won a battle. But they didn't go back to rescue their fallen from the disabled and the sunken triremes. And I guess triremes never actually sunk because they're just all wood. So they would like halfway submerge and the people below would drown. And I guess Greeks weren't the greatest swimmers. So even though the Greeks only had like a half mile to swim back to land, because they would never fight more than a half mile out of land, I guess none of them survived because it was in a storm. And the Greeks never went back to retrieve them because they were too lazy because it was a storm. And so they executed 6 of the generals for not rescuing those soldiers. And and also in the beginning of Rome, this is how far back, like the evolution of the Mediterranean world is, and how developed the Mediterranean world is, and how developed it must have been in the Dark Ages, before the Dark Ages. In the Bronze Age, before the Bronze Age collapse, in the time of the Minoans and everything, like the entire Mediterranean was one huge civilization, and it even spread out to Ireland. If you read the Irish Book of Invasions, the Irish Book of Invasions will tell you that 2,500 years ago, they even tell you how long ago it was, 55 boats from Scythia, Russia, went down across the Black Sea, through the Mediterranean, and all the way up to Ireland, because they were in communication with the Scythians, because they asked them to bring them out because they had a war. So the entire Mediterranean was one giant world communicating with each other. All the way out to Ireland, they were communicating with Ireland. 1500 BC, 3,500 years ago. And then there was a collapse. And they had 400 years of no written language. During the time of Homer, there was no written language. But then the Dorians came down, repopulated with their language, and they became this whole world culture again, even from earliest times. So in the year, and kind of in around the same time, like in the year 750s-ish, was when they started having like kings and stuff in Sparta and Athens, and that's the same time that it happened. There's my roommate for the 3rd time. That's the same thing that happened in Rome. was founded by Trojans and Spartans, because when Troy fell, Aeneas traveled to Italy and he teamed up with the Aborigines. That was the name. That's where the word comes from, a tribe called the Aborigines. And then he created a town, a kingdom called Alba Longa. So it was the son of Aeneas, and then Alba Longa created Rome from their royal family. Romulus and Remus were princes of Alba Longa, which were their parent was deposed, but they were from royal family. And so Romulus didn't have enough people from Alba Longa, so they raped the Sabines. There was a tribe of Sabines up in the mountains who they invited down to watch their games, and they grabbed all the women and pulled them in their houses, and so the people had to go home and like chase the people home, and so they had a war, which ended up being, but then the women jumped out of the houses and said, no more fighting, let's just have peace. So they created peace by having two kings. Romulus was co-king with the king of the Sabines. And they were co-kings for a while, but then that king was assassinated when he went on a visit to another city-state, and Romulus didn't attack the city-state, and so he just got to be king. But the Sabines were a Lacedaemonian colony. They were a colony from the Peloponnesian, from the area that Sparta controlled. They were a Spartan colony. So Rome was founded by Trojans and Spartans in 750 BC, which was 300 years before all this Peloponnesian stuff was going on. So, it was a really developed world back in a long time. So this was kind of like a long time coming, but I guess the triremes technology only got going in like the 550s to 500 BC, like right before the Persians came. So maybe the Persians invaded because they were getting threatened by this burgeoning culture of civilization of Greeks who were doing business with the Egyptians when it was the Persians who wanted to be doing business with the Egyptians. So yeah, I mean, Greece, it was a tragedy. It just came and then went. But luckily we had that one generation. We have like 10,000 pages. When I do the video in like a month or two, because now I'm fired up to do it, I'll know all this. I'll know how much literature comes from Athens versus Rome, because it's about the same. But I'm curious because Cicero, the most prolific Roman writer, is about 3,300 pages, and that's about the same as Plato, the most prolific Greek writer. That's the same size of their biggest book, 3,300 pages, about the size of the Bible, and about the same size as Livy's biggest book. But then Plato wrote like an 800-page book, and then Aristotle wrote like the best book, Politics, which is like 500 pages. But anyways, yeah, right under 2 hours. So it's about 2 hours for version 1. But like next month, I'll get my facts straight, and I'll have more to say about it. But that's basically the Peloponnesian War. It just tells you how fickle society is, how easy it is to get stuck in the past and follow your old ways from the past and the barbaric, how people have a tendency to be hypocrites and not allow everybody to have representation. They want to have only their people, how people don't realize that their civilization is on their way out and it's an old system, and how barbaric can be, how people don't think things through logistically, like with the fountains and the water of Athens. And we need to be more patient and more understanding and more intelligent, and we need to fuel, like with money and sponsorships, people to talk about history, because when you have a dictatorship, that's where the literature goes away. There was no literature in the time of Alexander the Great or in the Empire of Rome. It was all in the Republic of Rome. So anyways, that's the Peloponnesian War in under 2 hours. Talk to you later. Yeah, and I'll do requests if anybody really wants me to do something that's that's intellectual.